It's Brad's Laboratory.
I have been wanting a high banker for a while. With gold hog prices from $600 to $2,000, I thought maybe I could do it cheaper and make a high banker that worked better in Colorado gravel. I have a cheap sluice box that I bought off of Amazon. I will build the high banker around this sluice box. I start with cardboard, cutting it and taping it together to get the dimensions I want. I decide to make it in two parts, the upper hopper and the lower splash chamber. I am thinking I want to make this high banker as strong as possible, so I decide to fix the upper hopper to the lower splash chamber instead of making it adjustable. After all, I can adjust the angle somewhat with the legs I will be installing. Once I am happy with the cardboard model, I use the cardboard to trace out the patterns on 1/8" aluminum sheet. This thickness of aluminum, while difficult to work with, will make for a strong high banker. I cut out the patterns with a jigsaw and mark where I want the bends to happen. Clamping the piece to my workbench, I attempt to bend and have a complete failure. The plexi I'm using as a lever to do the bend breaks, and I have to rethink the whole bending process. After a trip to see my brother, I bring back my Harbor Freight press to use. I try to use a couple pieces of angle iron to start the bend, but this is difficult to line up and doesn't work that well. After I was done, I noticed that Swag makes a kit for this press that allows bending much easier. But I didn't have that, so I worked with what I had. I worked off camera as I was being frustrated by the process, but I managed to get the lower splash chamber bent. If I was to build this again, I wouldn't bend the flaps around the end. I would use a propane torch and a aluminoid rod to braze the seams together. I did film the bending process of the upper hopper. I used the press as a clamp and then beat the aluminum to bend it. The unit from Swag would make the process a ton easier. I finished up some of the smaller bends in my bench vise. With most of the bends done, it is time to assemble it and see if it looks right. Next, I start on the leg brackets. These need to be built to allow the legs to adjust up and down. This will allow the sluice run to be leveled and tilt adjusted. Adjustable legs also allow the high banker to conform to the rough terrain in Colorado. I discovered that electrical conduit fits inside some plumbing pipe, so I make the brackets with some flat steel stock and steel pipe. I start by cutting 4 lengths of flat stock and drilling holes in them for mounting. Next, I cut 4 pieces of pipe, grinding the black paint off the pipe to allow for a good connection when I weld. Clamping them up in the vise and a pair of pliers, I weld the pipe to the mounting plate. The welding of these pieces proved to be more of a problem than I thought. Trying to make the welds look nice and be plenty strong took quite a bit of time. Once welded, I drilled a hole in the pipe for the adjustment screw. I then tapped the hole. I tried to keep all the hardware on this build the same size, and I used 1/4 as that size. Next, I welded a nut onto the pipe to add more threads to the hole. This proved difficult as the welding would deform the nut and trap the bolt I was using to align the threads. As I only had 4 to do, I struggled through, having to grind a couple off and redo them. Eventually, I got them all done and cleaned up the threads with a tap. Next, I tapped the holes I had drilled in the mounting plate, tapping from the backside as the screws would be coming through that way. A little cleanup with a file and they were ready for paint. I actually tumbled these in a rock tumbler to clean them up really good. I then dunked the parts in acetone to clean off any residue before a quick coat of red primer. Then a coat of bright silver to match the aluminum of the high banker. The hardest and most time-consuming part of the build was the leg adjusting brackets. Searching on Amazon today reveals a Sluice box DIY leg kit for $80. This may be a better way to go if you're wanting to build a high banker of your own. Next, I use some aluminum angle to support the cheap sluice box. This is what I will mount the leg brackets to. I mark out where I want the legs to be with the tilt set on the sluice box. I mark the mounting holes so that they're straight up and down. I drill the holes in the rails for mounting the leg brackets. Then I countersink the back sides. This will allow me to use flathead screws that will be flush. This in turn allows the sluice box to set in the rails without modification. Next, I measured the existing holes in the sluice box that mounted the input flare. I transfer these measurements to the rails. I have bolted the rails together to make sure the holes are in the same place and to save time drilling them. On one of the rails, I mark, drill, and hole saw out some material to make a clearance for the existing handle on the sluice box. A little bit of cleanup on the rails with files and a belt sander, and I am ready to move on to mounting the lower splash box to them. I clamp the lower splash box to the rails and drill through the holes in the rails into the splash box. Once started, I remove the splash box and finish drilling the holes. I repeat for the hole at the front of the splash box and then the opposite rail. Next, I cut some electrical conduit I will be using for the legs. A little assembly and I can see the high banker coming together. Now it is time to mark the holes for mounting the upper hopper. Once these holes are drilled, I clamp the upper hopper on and match drill the mounting hole into it. Now it is starting to look like a proper high banker. I do some more drilling to mount the spray tubes. The plumbing I start out with consists of 2 tubes spraying out at 45 degrees crossing in the middle of the upper hopper. A valve on each of the tube allows for individual adjustment. I have been trying to figure out what pump to purchase for this high banker. A quick test with the pump I had proved I needed to move quite a bit of water. However, the sluice box flowed nicely. I ordered a pump and moved on to building the Grizzly. I built the Grizzly using 1/4 inch rod, leaving a 1/4 inch between the rods. I butted them up to a piece of flat stock and welded them one by one in place. Once done welding, I ground one side flat and I drilled and tapped a pair of holes to mount it to the upper hopper. I drilled and countersunk 2 mounting holes for the Grizzly in the upper hopper. Next, I start reworking the plumbing for the new pump. I redo the T with a larger cross for more flow. I add a faucet just for fun. The pump arrives. I decided bigger is better. I bought a 4,700 gallon per hour 12 volt DC pump with a 2-inch output. I also bought some 2-inch flat hose from Harbor Freight. To make the flat hose fit on the cross I put together earlier, I chuck it up in the lathe and turn one end down slightly, leaving a small hump to help hold the hose on. Testing in my front yard proves the pump is plenty powerful. The water is dancing down the sluice box perfectly. Next, I take it out to the Platte River for a test run. Only a few specks of gold are recovered, so some changes are required. I built new spray bars that showered the hopper with water instead of the crossflow. I also cut another inch out of the area that drops the dirt down through the Grizzly into the splash box. Water was flowing out the back of the hopper as it splashed against the rocks, so by opening this up a little more and changing to spray tubes, the majority of the water is now flowing into the splash box. Another river test, this time successful, with a good amount of gold caught. We catch the fine tailing to check for gold. We find a few specks, but we are catching approximately 90% in the sluice box. I have continued to run this for almost a year now, and I have moved the Grizzly down so that the end of it rests on the edge of the splash box. I have removed all the ripples and rubber matting from the sluice box and replaced it with gold cube vortex mat. I tried a punch plate and miner's moss in the bottom of the splash box originally, but have since replaced it with gold cube vortex mat. I have also upgraded the battery I bought originally to a lithium-ion battery for lighter weight and more runtime at the river.
It's Brad's Laboratory. It's kinda crazy and a little bit weird, but it's gonna be awesome sauce, 'cause it's Brad's Laboratory. It's Brad's Laboratory. So grab a spot, you'll learn a lot, maybe even how to build a robot, 'cause it's Brad's Laboratory.